Salute. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Howdy, folks. My name is Phoebe Clay. My family first came to Clover Bottom in 1775, and we were the first European settlers in those numbers. We came following the old Buffalo Trail up this beautiful Bluestone Valley, and we carried everything we owned on the pack horses, and we walked beside them. And we tilled the land, we cleared it, we tilled it, and we built our cabin and barns, and we lived here peacefully until, for about 8 years, until the year of 1783. In September of that year, my husband Mitchell, he decided that he had to go for salt, for the fall hunt was upon us. And he and James Mitchell, James were going to go. And so he prepared to go. And my two oldest boys, they were going to go hunting, for we were needing meat for the table. And Mitchell, he put my other two boys, Bartley and Ezekiel, to work down in the bottom to build fences around the haystacks so to keep the stock out of the hay. And I had told Tabitha to go down to the river to wash clothes with some of the other boys. And me and Megan, we were there in the cabin. And we were tending the chores, trying to get things done for tending the lambs and such. And so, unknown to us, there had been Indians watching our cabin for several days. And they knew that the men had left. And they had waited until the men were out of earshot before they had decided to attack our cabin. They knew that the men had taken anything for us to defend ourselves. And so they crossed the river and sneaked upon the boys down in the field and attacked them. And as I was in the cabin, when I heard a shot ring out across the bottom, I jumped up from what I was doing and I ran out the cabin door. I ran into a man from down in the New River Settlement. And so it was a Mr. Belcher, and he had heard a shot too. And when we went down into the park, this is what we saw. We saw Bartley lying upon the ground, and he lay there as though he had been shot. And we saw Ezekiel, and he was struggling with Indians. He was surrounded by Indians. Indians, what is Indians doing here? We have not seen Indians since we lived here. And he is surrounded by Indians, and he's struggling, and he's got his arms behind his back, and he's struggling. And those Indians have taken him captive. And Bartley's laying on the ground. And so I'm trying to take all this in, and Mr. Blankenship, he's standing beside of me. And then all of a sudden, here comes Tabitha. Here comes Tabitha from the river. Oh Lord, I forgot about Tabitha. And here she comes, and she's on the run with the other Indians behind her. And here they come, and they're on the run. And she's running right by where the Indians are and the boys. And as she comes by, she sees things that are starting to happen there with the boys. And there's a big old Indian, and he is bending over Bartley. And as he bends over Bartley, he pulls out a big old scalping knife, and he's going to scalp my boy Bartley. And as he bends over Bartley, he's pulling out that big old scalping knife, and Tabitha, she's running by. And as she sees him, what he's going to do, she starts to scream, "No! No, you can't do that! Not to my brother!" And so she runs over to him, and she gives him a great big push, and pushes him away from Bartley, and then he comes back at Tabitha, and she begins to wrestle with that Indian. And as she wrestles with him, she wrests away that big old scalping knife, and she pitches him over to the side. And that Indian, he's just astonished that this girl can do this. And so they begin to wrestle and fight, and the Indian, he gets the knife back, and he begins to stab and slice at Tabitha. And I am up here looking down upon the scene in the field, and so is Mr. Blankenship. And I start to scream, "Mr. Blankenship, shoot that Indian!" And Mr. Blankenship, he has his gun, and he can shoot that Indian, but he's afraid he'll shoot Tabitha also, and he's also afraid to discharge that gun because it is only one shot, and then it'll be empty, and he has to reload before he can shoot again. And he knows that the Indians can rush the cabin and take us all prisoner, and he knows that he can hold the Indians off with that one shot. And so he hesitates, "Mr. Blankenship, shoot that Indian!" And "Please, Mr. Blankenship, shoot that Indian, for God's sake, shoot that Indian." But he continues to hesitate. And right before our very eyes, Tabitha is stabbed to death, and she's laying beside her brother. And I start to scream. And Mr. Blankenship, he takes me and he pushes me back into the cabin. And by that time, the other young'uns have made it to the cabin. And so we are inside the cabin. And the Indians are milling around down in the bottom. And so Mr. Blankenship says to me, he says, "Miss Clay, I am going to try to make it down to the New River settlements and give the alarm and try to get help." And he says to me, "You got to try to make it over to the Bailey cabin, to your nephew, and you got to make it over there where he is. And the Indians may follow me, and that way it will be all right." And I says, "Over to James Bailey's cabin? That's 6 miles. Over Black Oak. I can't go 6 miles through the wilderness with all these young'uns." And Mr. Blankenship says, "Well, I'm gone." And out the door he went, and he was gone. And there he went back across the bottom. And as he ran across the bottom, the Indians started to follow him. And they did. They followed him. And that's when I knew that I had to take the young'uns and go. And I started grabbing young'uns, and Becky grabbed young'uns, and off we went. And we had screaming and snotting young'uns, and as we went, we all were crying and carrying them. And we were afraid. We were afraid that the Indians were going to fall upon us and kill us and scalp us. We were afraid that maybe a panther or a wildcat would fall upon us, or a bear. But we kept going. 6 miles across Black Oak Mountain. And so we kept going until we reached James Bailey's cabin. And when we stumbled through his door and told him that our tale of terror, then he told me, he says, "Well, I will have to try to make it down to the New River settlements and give the alarm." And so out the door he went. And after he left, we burned the Lord. And there we were left with the rest of the day to stay, with our memories of the day. And so the day wore on. At evening, my men had to return to the cabin. Mitchell and James Moore returned, and the boys had been tracking a deer all day and had got back late. And so, when they returned, they found the youngins down in the pool, dead. And so they carried them up to the cabin, and they left them there. And then they traveled, and it took them all night to travel down to the river settlements. And when they got near to the settlements, they came upon a group of men that had formed together to try to track the Indians, because Mr. Blankenship had arrived at the river settlements with the Indians following him almost all the way. And James Bailey had made it through there also. And so James Bailey was with that group of men. And they were going to try to track those Indians, because James had told them and said Mr. Belcher that Ezekiel had been taken captive. And that's when Mitchell found out then that the rest of us had been taken captive. So by then it was about daylight, and they could see tracks, and so they could start tracking. And they tracked all day and followed those Indians. Some were on horseback, some were not. And so they continued, and they continued many, many miles. And finally, at one point, the Indians split up. And so the settlers had to decide which group they was going to follow, because they were a small group, and so they followed the group on foot. At evening, they decided on a camping place, and while trying to gather together wood for their camping, they found that the Indians had camped nearby. And so it was decided that they would attack those Indians come daybreak. At daybreak, they attacked the Indians, and they killed several Indians, and the rest scattered. And when it was all said and done, there was no Ezekiel there. And when they were questioning some of the Indians that they had captured, Ezekiel was with the other group. And so the settlers said, what are we going to do now? And so they decided to return to their homes. And so my husband Mitchell and my boys and James Bailey and James Moore all returned here to the farm here in Colorado. And they grew Tabitha and Barbara here on the hill above the cabin. And then they made their way over right up to James Bailey's cabin. And when they did, they had to tell me what had transpired, and that they had not gotten Ezekiel. And then they had to decide who might be going up to try to ransom Ezekiel. And I said, no way was any of my boys going to go with Mitchell, because I'd already lost 2 children, maybe 3, and I wasn't going to have a chance of losing any more. So it was decided that my husband Mitchell and James Moore and James Bailey would go into the Indian territories to try to ransom Ezekiel. So they gathered up everything that they could think of to try to ransom Ezekiel, things that the Indians might use to trade. And so they packed up horses and they left. And they traveled up into the Ohio territory to the Indian town of Chillicothe. to that Indian town, and when they got there, that's when Mitchell discovered that he was there too late. That he had discovered that those Indians had burned Ezekiel at the stake. And they had, it was retaliation for the killing of some Indians that the white people had killed Indians. And so they had burned him at the stake. And so Mitchell gathered up his remains and brought his remains back here to Clover Bottom and buried him beside of his brother and sister. And then he had the task to come back over to James Bailey's and tell me what happened. I never could return here. There was too many bad memories here. And Mitchell never could get me to come back. We stayed a long while at James Bailey's farm. And finally, Mitchell bought us a farm in the New River settlements. And we built us a cabin there. We had us a farm. And we raised the rest of our children there. And we lived out our lives there in the New River settlements. And that, my friends, is the story of the Clay family on the Bluestone.
Phoebe just told you most of the stuff I was going to tell you, so I'm going to make this up as I go along. The posse that went after, or the militia that went after the Indians was made up of a man named Hare, a man named Hale, a man named Chapman, a man named Stewart, and they left Paris Station, which was the New River settlement, named after George Paris. George Paris was a soldier in the Revolutionary War who had been injured at the Battle of Cowpens, C-O-W-P-E-N-S, in South Carolina. And he came home after being wounded, and for about a month, his wife was ill and died after he got home. So he's a widower. The reason I'm telling you all these men's names, they all married the Clay daughters. Rebecca, who was the oldest, married George Paris. And that's basically the reason that Phoebe and Mitchell went down to what's called Paris Station. And now we call it Parisburg. It also was called Giles County Courthouse. That's the main reason they moved down there. Phoebe said she didn't want to come back here. Well, when Rebecca got married and was moving down there, Phoebe said, I'm going with Rebecca down there. It was a much bigger fort than the Bailey fort that was over in the Bluefield area. And so that's when she moved down there. And when they took all their daughters down there, then all those men that were single, that were in that posse, ended up marrying the girls. Ralph Stewart, one of the men that was in the posse, was a big Army hero in the Revolutionary War. He lived in the Giles County area. He had been one of the guards of General Howe at Yorktown when the Revolutionary War was about to be over and they had the general in custody. He was one of the guards. So a lot of history around here people aren't really aware of. But Ralph Stewart married one of the Clay girls. It was his second marriage. These were older men marrying young girls, but that's sort of the way. Women had no other way of dealing with life except to find a husband. And that's what they did. And the men had children by their first wives, and their wives were dead. They needed somebody to take care of their kids. So all these men married Clay girls. If you're from Athens and you know about Mr. French, Mr. French married a Clay girl. He was basically the beginning of Athens. And it's my understanding his descendants gave a lot of land for what became Concord College. By the Clays moving, there still was land left here. Let me tell you how they got the land. The land was given to a man named John Draper. And John Draper had been a soldier in the French and Indian War. And the King of England, who was George, I think it was George III, he gave land, because this was an English colony, and the king owned everything. He gave land to John Draper, 803, actually about 2,000 acres, in this general area. And John Draper sold or assigned to Mitchell Clay 803 acres. So we stand here and we look at the bottom, 800 acres is a lot of land. So they owned a lot of land. One of the things that Mitchell Clay had to do was to till the land, and he had a certain amount of acres he had to do every year. And so that's what he was trying to do to get this farm to stay his. Now, I want to tell you a story you probably haven't heard, and you might not want to hear. This gentleman will want to hear it. There was two little kids. They were 6 and 7, and this is back in the 1600s, and they were captured, two Indian children. They were captured by a man named Thomas Clay. He made them slaves. He bred them to African Americans, and they had kids. And the only problem is there was a law in England that also was here in what became America, that Indians could not be made slaves. And there also was a law that I know for sure is in Israel now. You are not Jewish in Israel unless your mother's Jewish. That's how you get to go to Israel and become a settler in Israel, if your mother's Jewish. And think about it. We all know who our mother is, or we hope we know who our mother is. We really don't know who our daddy is. You know, you think daddy's who mom tells you, but you don't know for sure. Nowadays you can do a DNA test and find out for sure. But in those days, the law was you are what your mother is. So this little girl that was captured at the age of 6, when she got older and was bred to an African American, it still meant her children were what she was. She was an Indian. When that child was bred to an African American and had kids, they were still Indians, because if the first girl's an Indian and her daughter's an Indian, then the granddaughter is also an Indian. So this little girl, the granddaughter, her name was Rachel Finley. She brought a lawsuit in around 1781 to declare that she was a free person because she was an Indian. And it was in Pocahontas County, Virginia. And while the jury was deciding whether she was an Indian or whether she was a black person, the Clays decided they didn't want her to be free. So they spirited her away to here. So Rachel Finley was here when all this was going on. You never hear anything about her in the history books, but she was here with the Clay family. She was first taken away by William Mitchell Clay. William Mitchell Clay was killed at the Battle of Point Pleasant. He was shot by an Indian while he was out hunting for deer to feed the troops. And so then her ownership passed to Mitchell Clay, who was the Mitchell Clay we're talking about today. So Rachel's a slave, and Mitchell Clay is having to pay John Draper for the land. A slave has a lot of worth, so he gives his slave and her daughter to John Draper as part payment on this land. So now she's with John Draper. Unbeknownst to her, the jury verdict came in Pocahontas County, and they said she's free. She's not a slave. She has no way of knowing. This is the frontier. This is the place, the first people who ever came into Mercer County. And so she doesn't have any way to get a lawyer. She doesn't know anything. So time elapses. She gets to be 60s in her 60s, and she finds out that she had been free. But John Draper's family, because John Draper's now dead, John Draper's family won't let her go. So she brings a lawsuit down in Wythe County to try to get her freedom. 5 or 6 years, the courts played with her, you know, and did nothing. Then eventually the courts said, well, this shouldn't be brought here in Wythe County. This should be back in Pocahontas County. So they moved it to Pocahontas County. She finally had her day in court, and she got her freedom. The jury decided, and they awarded her 1 penny for 45 years of servitude. They gave her a penny. Now, comes the fun part. John Draper's family, and by the way, she has children, grandchildren, and all of them are slaves, but now they're free. John Draper's family brings a lawsuit against Mitchell Clay's family because Mitchell Clay paid for that land with a slave. Never mind they had her 40 years. They said that was a worthless transaction, and so they sued. And they won, and they had to pay the worth of that slave. And the person who had to pay was the executors of Mitchell Clay's estate. In those days, if you were an executor of an estate, you were responsible for any debts the estate owed. So having to pay for the worth of this slave bankrupted George Paris and William Smith, also as an executor. Who, by the way, William Smith was the gentleman that gave them the money, gave them the land for the courthouse in Princeton, 1837. But anyway, you never hear about this lady. Her name's Rachel Finley. Google her sometime, and there was a book made about it. But that's the bad side of the Clay family. We think the Indians are the bad guys in this story. Everybody's a bad guy and a good guy, both. Because, and I'll tell you another thing that they did to the Indians, and I'm not up here as an apologist for Indians, but I just want to tell the whole story. One of the Clay sons shot an Indian that night when they were all asleep, and they woke up and shot them all, and he only wounded him. And Edward Hare shot him and killed him. And then Mr. Hare, and I'm sorry I don't remember which other one, cut off part of the skin on his back. What? Wiley, yes, Mr. Hare and Mr. Wiley. Cut the skin off of his back and used it as a razor strike. And many, many, many years later, the family still had it, but now it's sort of disappeared. I mean, you know, like I say, everybody's good guys and bad guys in the story. Eventually, one of the Clay granddaughters, whose name was Rebecca Clay Paris, she married Judge David Johnson. If you know anything about history around here, you've read the Johnson history book. The History of the New Rivers and Continuous Territories, I think that's the name of it. Judge Johnson was a judge in Princeton, Confederate Army veteran, and he married the Clay granddaughter. It was named after her grandmother, Rebecca Clay. Her name was Rebecca Clay Paris. They built a house in Princeton that was burned when Princeton was burned in 1862, but the house only half burned. It was a log cabin, and they built another house around it. And if you have been around here and are aware of anything that went on around here, just as Lois preserved this, and we got to give Lois kudos for that. Lois tried to preserve the Judge Johnson house. We could not get any cooperation from any of the elected officials, and could not get any cooperation from the lady who owned the house. And so the house was torn down. So a big piece of Princeton history went bye-bye. Thank God for Lois getting this. Judge Johnson eventually moved out to Oregon or Washington to join other of his children. So the Clay family just sort of, with him, the Clay family that was really known moved away. But don't forget, Mr. French over in Athens was married to a Clay. Mr. Hare was married to a Clay. Mr. Wiley was married to a Clay. Mr. Chapman, there were so many of them married to those girls. So for the girls moving down to the New River Valley, was a good thing. They found husbands. Now, the Celanese. Everybody know where the Celanese is? The Celanese is the Clay farm. Phoebe talked to you about moving down there. They moved down there, and they bought it from a man named Ingalls. And you've probably heard of Mary Draper Ingalls. It's the same family. They bought the land and they farmed it, and they buried all their people there. Phoebe and Mitchell were buried there, and a lot of their kids. And the Celanese comes along and buys the farm, and there's the cemetery. Within the Celanese decides they want to build another building, and there's the cemetery. So they went in with a backhoe and dug up all the graves and moved them over to the, I want to say Birchlawn Cemetery in Harrisburg. And you can find Phoebe and Mitchell buried there instead of buried here. They're buried down there because they were moved by the Celanese to put another plant. But next time you go by the Celanese, say hello to the land of Mitchell and Phoebe. First people in Mercer County. I got to tell you, the way they got here, this is sort of personal to me. The James Bailey that they went to his cabin was my fourth great granddaddy. And Richard Bailey and his wife, Elizabeth Belcher Bailey, came to the Bluefield area. At the same time, Isham Belcher, Elizabeth's brother, came to Tazewell County, to Abbs Valley. At the same time, Mitchell Clay and his wife, Phoebe Belcher Clay, who was a sister to Elizabeth and Isham, came here. These three families all came here at the first time. Now, why isn't Richard and Elizabeth the first settlers in Mercer County? That's because at this time it was all Virginia, and now where they are over there, where their land was, is now still in Virginia. So they came at the same time, but they were not in what's now Mercer County. So, if you're a Belcher, you're probably, by the way, Isham Belcher's wife was a Clay. So here comes the Belcher and the Clay, the Belcher and the Bailey, and the Belcher and another Clay. These people were all intermarried. So today, if you're doing your genealogy and you're a Belcher from this area, you're also a Bailey, you're also a Clay. If you're a Clay, you're a Belcher. So it's funny, people say, oh, I'm not related to them. Well, are you a Belcher? And probably you are related to them because Belcher was the wife. So anyway, now that I'm on genealogy, which is my biggest subject, Lois has the distinction, Mercer County Historical Society has the distinction of having the only genealogical library that is accepted by the West Virginia Library Council in southern West Virginia. Princeton Library isn't accepted. No other library except the Mercer County Library is accepted to do genealogy. And she has about 700 volumes in that library.
900.
Huh?
900.
900. Oh, I haven't been down there in a while. So if you're doing genealogy and you want to find out about the Clays, you want to find out about the Belchers, you want to find out about the Baileys or any family, go down there. Open 8:30 to 1:30.
8 to 2.
Yeah. So, and that's about my story. Next time you come together, I'll tell you about Princeton getting burnt. So that was long after the Clays were gone. Thank you.
Mercer County Commissioner Greg Puckett couldn't be here tonight. Today he is in Fayetteville, and so I want to have Eric Dye. He is the sculptor of this. Come forward, and him and I are going to be good friends. And let him tell you about his project with this sculpture.
42 years ago, on a very raw November day, this statue was dedicated on the courthouse lawn in Princeton for the first time. And I want to say it was cold and wet and rainy, misty. It wasn't pouring down rain, just misty, and I shivered all through it. Somebody asked me at that time, they were talking about the statue, was it worth it? Because I'd spent far more to do it than I actually got paid to do it. And I said, I'll let you know in 10 years. Well, it's a little more than 10 years, and it was the last large stone sculpture I ever did. I never had another opportunity to do any more large stone sculptures. Looking at it now, there's lots of things that I've forgotten about. Things that I remember. I'm not sure who decided to use native sandstone, but my art professor at Concord, I was a recent graduate, Jim Coyner, knew I carved local native stone, and I suspect he's the one that put me up to this, and told him about me. I made a model. I wish I knew where the model was, the ceramic model. I have no idea where the ceramic model is now. The Bicentennial Committee had it at one time. But we went out to the quarry. What did you, the name of the quarry? The Gardner Quarry, and found this piece of stone there. It was already cut loose from the sides of the quarry, and it was just laying there in the bottom. And we looked at it there and figured out it would be large enough. And we had an old stonemason by the name of Steve Worrell who went with us. And he looked at it, and he told Mr. Coyner, he said, it's not worth splitting and laying. And he told Mr. Coyner, he'll never get anything carved out of it. Well, I got something carved out of it. It took about a year, and I got to looking. I spent a year on a piece of stone that has the hardness of granite without the permanency of granite. And Michelangelo carving marble, which is, they have a scale called Mohs scale, and granite's right at an 8 and a 9, and this is at a 7.5 to 8. Marble is a 3 and a 4. It took Michelangelo a little over 2 years to carve David, which is a little bit taller than this, and I had basically a year to get it done. So I think I did fairly well to get as much done as I did. I wish I'd had more time on different parts of it, but I'm looking at her expression now, and I see again the sorrow that she experienced. But also see the courage that she had when she placed her hand in the small of his back. Now this scene never happened, just in my imagination. But as she places her hand in the small of his back, giving him the encouragement from her to go do what he knows that he has to do to try to rescue Ezekiel. At the same time, the two hands clasped, unity and support. And Mitchell's fist clenched, trying to hold in the anger and the hurt. And I think as we hear the stories about what happened with the Indians that day and some other things, there was Captain Matthew Farley from up in Bearwalla Flats. It was also a part of that party. He just didn't come back to get a wife. He already had one. And I hear the stories about what caused the Shawnee Indians to be on raiding parties in this part of the county because of the attacks that happened at Point Pleasant when they were trying to negotiate a peace settlement. And it stirred up so much anger. And it brings to me to mind one thing that's so relevant in our world today, and that's communication. So much of the time, we're spending time finding fault with the other person and not spending time to talk among ourselves. And Mitchell and Phoebe, in clasping hands together, took that time from themselves to know what they needed to do. And we as a society have to learn with that courage, in spite of all the hurt, to go forth and spend time communicating with those around us so that we don't have that hurt and bitterness that these two experienced that day and the others. Thank you.
My name is Kenneth Clay.